The blade gleamed in the dim lantern light of the saloon, its edge catching the cowboy's eye before he even felt the cold steel press against his wrist. And in that moment, Adam Everett knew he'd never met a woman quite like this one before. Georgia Dawson had learned long ago that men who reached for you, without asking, never had good intentions. Her father had taught her that lesson the hard way, and the scars on her back were a constant reminder of why she kept a knife strapped to her thigh beneath her dusty traveling skirt. The year was 1878, and Alamosa, Colorado, was a town built on silver mining and broken promises, where women like her were expected to be either wives or whores, with precious little room for anything in between. She'd only been in town 3 days, just long enough to find work at the general store and a room above the seamstress shop. Just long enough to start hoping that maybe this place would be different from all the others she'd run from. Just long enough to let her guard slip when the tall cowboy with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of whiskey had reached across the bar to touch her hand. The saloon went quiet. Every man in the place knew what came next when a woman pulled a weapon, whether she was serious about using it or just trying to make a point. But Adam didn't pull back, didn't reach for his own gun, didn't even flinch. He just looked at her with those amber eyes and said, voice calm as a summer morning, "I'll wait till you reach for mine." George's hand trembled slightly. She wasn't used to this response. Men usually got angry, defensive, violent even. They called her names, threatened her, tried to grab the knife away. But this cowboy just sat there, patient as stone, his hand still extended palm up on the bar between them like an offering rather than a demand. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said I'll wait," Adam repeated, and something in his tone made her believe him. "I shouldn't have presumed. My mother raised me better than that, and I apologize. But I meant no harm, miss. I was just trying to introduce myself proper." Slowly, Georgia lowered the blade, though she didn't sheath it. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and she could feel the weight of every eye in the saloon watching this strange exchange. The bartender, a grizzled man named Chester, was holding his breath behind the counter. 2 miners at the corner table had their hands on their pistols, ready to intervene if things went sideways. "You always introduce yourself by grabbing at women?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "No, madam," Adam said, and he had the decency to look embarrassed. "I was trying to help you with that crate you were struggling with earlier. Saw you trying to load it onto the wagon outside the general store. Figured I'd offer my assistance, but I guess I went about it all wrong." Georgia remembered the heavy crate, filled with dry goods that needed to be delivered to the boarding house on the edge of town. She'd been wrestling with it for a good 10 minutes, too stubborn to ask for help, too aware of what men usually wanted in exchange for their aid. She'd finally managed to muscle it into the wagon herself, though her arms had ached something fierce afterward. "I managed just fine on my own," she said, but some of the edge had left her voice. "I could see that," Adam replied, and now there was a hint of admiration in his tone. "You're stronger than you look, Miss Dawson, but that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone." The fact that he knew her name shouldn't have surprised her. Alamosa was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business within a day or two. But hearing it on his lips felt strangely intimate, and she found herself looking at him more closely. He was older than her, maybe late 20s to her 22 years, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore dusty trail clothes and well-worn boots, the kind that spoke of long days in the saddle and hard work under the Colorado sun. "How do you know my name?" she asked, finally sliding the knife back into its sheath. "Same way I know you're from somewhere back east, probably Missouri or Kansas, and that you're running from something that put that haunted look in your eyes," Adam said quietly. "Small town like this, word travels fast. But don't worry, most folks here are running from something. That's why they came west in the first place." Georgia felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to being read so easily, and it made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the knife she'd just brandished. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. "Maybe not," Adam conceded, "but I'd like to if you'll let me." She wanted to say no. Every instinct she'd honed over the past 5 years told her to walk away, to keep her distance, to never let anyone get close enough to hurt her again. But there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate, something genuine and patient that she hadn't seen in a long time. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you want to know me? I just pulled a knife on you." Adam's lips quirked into a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because you remind me of a wild horse I tried to break once, beautiful, fierce, terrified of being touched. Took me 3 months before she'd even let me near her, and another 2 before she'd eat from my hand. But once she trusted me, she was the finest mount I ever had. Loyal, brave, would run through fire if I asked her to." "I'm not a horse," Georgia said flatly. "No, madam, you're not," Adam agreed. "You're a woman who's been hurt bad enough to carry a weapon and know how to use it. You're someone who's learned that the world is cruel and men are crueler. And I'm guessing you're someone who's tired of running but doesn't know how to stop." His words hit too close to home, and Georgia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to show weakness in front of this stranger, no matter how kind his words sounded. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" "Not particularly," Adam said. "Just observant. And I know pain when I see it, because I've carried my own share." Before Georgia could respond, the saloon doors swung open and a group of rowdy miners stumbled in, their voices loud and slurred from whatever rotgut they'd been drinking at the other establishment down the street. The mood in the room shifted immediately, tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. "Well, well," one of the miners said, his eyes landing on Georgia with an unpleasant gleam. "Fresh meat. Haven't seen you before, sweetheart. You new in town?" Georgia's hand went instinctively back to her knife, but Adam was already moving. He stood slowly, positioning himself between her and the approaching miners with a casual grace that spoke of years of handling trouble. He wasn't a big man, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made him seem larger, more dangerous. "Evening, boys," Adam said, his voice friendly but firm. "Miss Dawson here is just having a quiet drink. How about you fellows find yourselves another corner to occupy?" The lead miner, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek and breath that reeked of cheap whiskey, sneered at Adam. "Didn't know she was yours, Everett, though I can't say I see any ring on her finger." "She's not mine," Adam said calmly. "She's her own person. But she's also not interested in your company, so I suggest you move along before this gets unpleasant." Georgia watched the exchange with her heart in her throat. She'd seen this play out before, knew how quickly words could turn to violence in places like this. But instead of reaching for a weapon, Adam just stood there, relaxed and ready, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. For a long moment, the miner seemed to consider his options. He was bigger than Adam, and he had 3 friends backing him up. But there was something in Adam's eyes that gave him pause, some warning that said going down this road would end badly for everyone involved. "Fine," the miner spat finally. "Keep your little Spitfire. Probably more trouble than she's worth anyway." The miners moved to the far side of the saloon, and Adam settled back onto his bar stool as if nothing had happened. But Georgia noticed his hand didn't move far from his gun belt, and his eyes kept tracking the group's movements in the mirror behind the bar. "Thank you," Georgia said quietly. "But I could have handled them myself." "I don't doubt it," Adam replied. "But sometimes it's easier to avoid a fight than to win one. Those boys are drunk and stupid, but they're not evil. Give them a few hours to sleep it off and they'll barely remember this happened." Georgia studied him in the lamplight, trying to understand this strange cowboy who apologized for touching her hand and then defended her without being asked. "Who are you, Adam Everett?" "Just a man trying to make his way in the world," he said with a shrug. "I run cattle between here and Saguache, manage a small ranch about 10 miles north of town. Lost my wife and baby daughter to fever 3 years back, been mostly keeping to myself since then. Until tonight." The pain in his voice was raw and real, and Georgia felt something shift in her chest. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, meaning it. "Thank you," Adam said. "It gets easier with time, or so people tell me. Mostly it just gets different, but I'm learning to live with it, learning that being alone isn't the same as being lonely." "No," Georgia agreed softly. "It's not." They sat in companionable silence for a while, nursing their drinks and watching the saloon come alive around them. A piano player had started up in the corner, banging out a cheerful tune that seemed at odds with the serious conversation they'd just had. Men laughed and gambled and told tall tales, while a few working girls circulated through the crowd, looking for customers. "Why did you come to Alamosa?" Adam asked eventually. Georgia considered lying, but something about this man made her want to tell the truth. "I needed to get away from Kansas City. Had a situation there that didn't end well." "What kind of situation?" "The kind where a rich man's son thinks he can take what he wants, and when a girl fights back, she's the one who gets blamed," Georgia said bitterly. "I didn't kill him, though I thought about it. Just cut him enough to make my point and ran before the law could get involved." Adam was quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening. "Did he hurt you?" "He tried," Georgia said. "But I've been carrying that knife since I was 15, and I know how to use it. My daddy might have been a mean drunk, but he taught me how to defend myself before he drank himself to death." "Good," Adam said fiercely. "Any man who forces himself on a woman deserves worse than a knife wound." "You did right, Georgia. Don't let anyone tell you different." Hearing him say her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her body. She'd been called many things over the years, but something about the way Adam spoke made her name sound like something precious, something worth protecting. "So now I'm here," she continued, trying to start over for about the 5th time. "Working at the general store, saving up money, hoping that maybe this place will be different." "It could be," Adam said, "if you give it a chance. Alamosa's rough around the edges, but there are good people here. Folks who believe in hard work and keeping your word. Folks who'll stand by you when trouble comes calling." "People like you?" Georgia asked, and she wasn't sure if she was teasing or testing. "I'd like to think so," Adam said, "though I suppose you'll have to make up your own mind about that." The saloon was getting louder now, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Georgia found herself wanting to leave, to step outside into the cool Colorado night and breathe clean air. But she also found herself wanting Adam to come with her, which was a feeling so foreign it almost frightened her. "I should get back to my room," she said finally. "Have to be at the store early tomorrow." "Let me walk you," Adam offered, then quickly added, "if you want me to, I mean." "No pressure. Just seems like a good idea after that business with the miners." Georgia hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but just to the door. I don't need anyone getting the wrong idea about us." "Fair enough," Adam said, tossing a few coins on the bar to cover their drinks. They stepped out into the night together, and Georgia took a deep breath of mountain air that tasted like pine and snow from the distant peaks. Alamosa sat in a high valley, surrounded by the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east and the San Juan Range to the west. Even in late summer, the nights were cool enough to make her grateful for her shawl. The streets were mostly quiet now, with just a few other late-night wanderers making their way home. Adam walked beside her with an easy stride, keeping a respectful distance but staying close enough that she felt safe. It was a strange feeling, being protected without being owned, and Georgia wasn't quite sure what to make of it. "The moon's bright tonight," Adam observed, looking up at the silver orb hanging in the star-scattered sky. "Almost full." "It is," Georgia agreed. "Back in Missouri, my mother used to tell me that the full moon was when the spirit world was closest to ours. She was part Cherokee, believed in all sorts of old stories." "My grandmother was Ute," Adam said. "She had stories, too, about coyote spirits and mountain gods and how the first people came to be. Used to tell them to me when I was a boy before she passed." "Do you believe them?" Georgia asked. Adam was quiet for a moment, considering. "I believe there's more to this world than what we can see and touch. I believe in respecting the land and the creatures that live on it. And I believe that some things are meant to be, even when we can't explain them." They had reached the seamstress shop now, and Georgia found herself reluctant to go inside. The evening had been strange and unsettling, but also strangely comforting. For the first time in years, she'd had a real conversation with a man who didn't seem to want anything from her except her company. "Thank you for walking me home," she said, turning to face him, "and for what you said back there about me doing right." "I meant every word," Adam said. His eyes were dark in the moonlight, but she could still see the honesty in them. "You're brave, Georgia, braver than you probably know. It takes courage to keep starting over, to keep hoping that the next place will be better." "Or maybe it's just stubbornness," Georgia said with a small smile. "That too," Adam agreed, and his own smile was warm. "But there's nothing wrong with being stubborn. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us going." Georgia found herself looking at his hand, hanging loose at his side. She thought about what he'd said in the saloon, about waiting until she reached for him. It was such a simple thing, but it felt revolutionary. No man had ever given her that choice before, that power to decide when and if she wanted to be touched. "What are you doing tomorrow?" she asked suddenly. "Got to check on the herd, make sure none of the cattle wandered off during the night," Adam said. "Why do you ask?" "I finish work at the store around 4 in the afternoon," Georgia said. "If you're back in town by then, maybe we could have supper together. Somewhere public, somewhere respectable." Adam's face lit up with a smile that transformed his whole appearance, making him look younger and more hopeful. "I'd like that very much. There's a decent restaurant next to the hotel, serves a good steak and potatoes. Would that suit you?" "That would suit me fine," Georgia said. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she reached out and briefly touched his hand with her fingertips. It was the lightest of contacts, barely more than a brush of skin against skin, but Adam's expression told her he understood the significance of the gesture. "Good night, Georgia," he said softly. "Good night, Adam," she replied. And then she was inside, climbing the narrow stairs to her small room with her heart beating faster than it had any right to. She lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about amber eyes and patient hands, about a man who understood pain and respected boundaries. She thought about the way he'd defended her without making her feel weak, the way he'd shared his own grief without expecting her to heal it. And most of all, she thought about the choice he'd given her, the power to reach out or pull back as she saw fit. It was a gift she'd never been offered before, and she wasn't quite sure what to do with it. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Georgia found herself imagining what it might be like to trust someone again, to let down her guard and see what happened. It was a terrifying thought, but also strangely exhilarating. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Georgia helped customers at the general store, restocking shelves and tallying accounts, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Adam, wondering if he'd really show up for supper or if last night had just been the whiskey talking. Men said all sorts of things in the moment, but keeping their word was another matter entirely. Her employer, a kindly widow named Mrs. Patterson, noticed her distraction. "You all right, dear? You seem a million miles away today." "Just tired," Georgia lied. "Didn't sleep well last night, Mrs." Patterson gave her a knowing look. "Wouldn't have anything to do with that handsome rancher you were seen walking with, would it? Don't look so surprised, child. This is a small town and people talk." Georgia felt her cheeks flush. "It's not like that. We just met." Mrs. Patterson said, clearly not believing a word of it. "Well, for what it's worth, Adam Everett is a good man. Honest, hard-working, treats people right. Lost his family in a terrible tragedy, but he's been slowly putting himself back together. Could use someone to care about, I think. And you could use someone who'll treat you decent." "I don't need anyone," Georgia said automatically. "Maybe not," Mrs. Patterson agreed, "but there's a difference between needing and wanting. And there's no shame in wanting a little companionship, especially out here where life can be so hard and lonely." The older woman's words stayed with Georgia throughout the day. She'd spent so long thinking about what she needed to survive, about staying safe and protecting herself, that she'd almost forgotten about wants. About the simple human desire for connection, for someone to talk to at the end of a long day, for a hand to hold when the nights got cold. When 4 o'clock finally came, Georgia changed out of her work apron and checked her reflection in the small mirror Mrs. Patterson kept behind the counter. Her dark blonde hair was coming loose from its braid, and there were dust smudges on her cheeks. She did her best to tidy herself, acutely aware that she owned only 2 dresses and this one was definitely the worse for wear. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Patterson said. "Now go on, get out of here. And don't worry about tomorrow morning. You can come in a little late if you need to." Georgia wanted to protest that it wouldn't be that kind of evening, but the knowing smile on the widow's face stopped her. Instead, she just nodded her thanks and headed out into the late afternoon sunshine. Adam was waiting outside the restaurant, cleaned up and wearing what were clearly his Sunday clothes. His hair was still damp from washing, and he'd shaved off the stubble that had shadowed his jaw the night before. When he saw her, his whole face brightened with a smile that made Georgia's stomach do a strange little flip. "You came," he said, and there was genuine relief in his voice. "So did you," Georgia replied. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would, didn't I?" Adam asked. "I don't make promises I can't keep." He offered her his arm, then seemed to think better of it and let it drop. Georgia appreciated the gesture, even as part of her wanted to take that arm, to feel the solid warmth of him beside her. But she wasn't ready yet, and he seemed to understand that. The restaurant was simple but clean, with checkered tablecloths and mismatched chairs. They settled at a table by the window, and a tired-looking waitress brought them coffee and menus written on a small chalkboard. "The steak is good," Adam said. "But the chicken is pretty decent too, if you prefer." "Steak sounds fine," Georgia said. She couldn't remember the last time someone had taken her out for a proper meal. Usually she ate alone in her room, picking at cold bread and cheese while she counted her meager savings and planned her next escape. They ordered, and then an awkward silence fell between them. It was strange, Georgia thought, how easy conversation had been the night before, fueled by danger and darkness and the strange intimacy of strangers meeting for the first time. But here in the daylight, in a public place where people could see them together, it felt different, More real somehow. More consequential. How was your day? Adam asked finally. Long, Georgia admitted, but all right. Mrs. Patterson sends her regards, by the way, says you're a good man. Mrs. Patterson is kind, Adam said, though I'm not sure I deserve the praise. I'm just trying to live right, same as anyone. That's more than most people manage, Georgia said. In my experience, anyway. Adam studied her across the table, his expression thoughtful. Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to. All right, Georgia said cautiously. That knife you carry. How long have you had it? Georgia's hand went instinctively to her thigh, where the blade rested in its leather sheath. 7 years. My daddy gave it to me when I turned 15, told me I'd need it to survive in this world. He was right about that, at least. You said he taught you to use it. He did, Georgia confirmed. Not because he cared about me, mind you, but because he had enemies and he figured if I could fight, I could help protect him when he was too drunk to stand. Worked me like a field hand, beat me when I talked back, then acted surprised when I finally got big enough to run away. The words came out bitter and hard, years of pain condensed into a few short sentences. Georgia hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about Adam's patient attention made her want to talk, to finally share the burden she'd been carrying alone for so long. How old were you when you left? Adam asked gently. 17. Took the knife, the clothes on my back, and what little money I'd managed to hide away. Been drifting ever since, working whatever jobs I could find, trying to stay ahead of trouble. Georgia laughed without humor. Though trouble seems to find me anyway, no matter how careful I am. You were just a child, Adam said, and there was anger in his voice now, not at her but for her. You should have been protected, cared for, not beaten and worked half to death. Should have been a lot of things, Georgia said with a shrug. But we don't get to choose our families or where we start out. We just have to make the best of what we're given. Their food arrived then, steaming plates of beef and potatoes and gravy that smelled like heaven. Georgia realized she was starving, having been too nervous to eat much during the day. She dug in with unladylike enthusiasm, too hungry to care about manners. Adam ate more slowly, watching her with a faint smile. When's the last time you had a proper meal? Couple days ago, Georgia said around a mouthful of steak. I usually just grab whatever's quick and cheap. Can't afford to eat like this every day on what Mrs. Patterson pays me. You should eat better, Adam said. A woman shouldn't have to go hungry just because she's making her own way in the world. Lot of things shouldn't be, Georgia replied, but they are. At least I've got a job and a roof over my head. That's more than some folks can say. They ate in silence for a while, and Georgia felt some of the tension drain out of her shoulders. There was something comforting about sharing a meal with someone, about the simple act of sitting across from another person and breaking bread together. It made her feel less alone, less adrift in a world that often seemed hostile and uncaring. Tell me about your ranch, she said eventually. What's it like? Adam's face softened with something that might have been love. It's not much, just a small spread with maybe 200 head of cattle and a few horses. Got a cabin I built myself. Nothing fancy, but it's solid and keeps out the weather. There's a stream that runs through the property, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. In the spring, wildflowers bloom all along the banks. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. Sounds peaceful, Georgia said wistfully. It is, Adam agreed. Sometimes too peaceful. Gets lonely out there by myself, with nothing but the cattle and the wind for company. I thought after Mary and the baby died that I wanted to be alone, that I didn't have room in my heart for anyone else. But lately, I've been wondering if maybe I was wrong about that. The way he looked at her when he said it made Georgia's breath catch in her throat. There was no mistaking his meaning, No pretending this was just a friendly supper between acquaintances. Adam Everett was courting her, as old-fashioned and deliberate as that sounded. And the strangest part was, she found she didn't mind. "I've never been good at letting people close," Georgia said quietly. "Every time I've tried, it's ended badly. I've learned to trust my knife more than I trust words or promises." "I understand that," Adam said. "Lord knows I do. After Mary died, I built walls so high around myself I thought nothing could get through. But walls are lonely places to live, Georgia. They keep out the hurt, but they keep out the good things too. The warmth, the connection, the possibility of something better." "What if I'm not ready to tear down my walls?" Georgia asked. "Then don't," Adam said simply. "But maybe you could consider opening a window, letting a little light in, seeing how it feels. No pressure, no expectations, just the possibility of something more." Georgia wanted to say no, to finish her meal and thank him politely and never see him again. It would be safer that way, cleaner. But she couldn't forget the way he'd respected her boundaries, the way he'd waited for her to reach out to him. She couldn't forget the loneliness in his eyes, a loneliness that matched her own. "I'm leaving for Saguache in 2 days," Adam said. "Got a cattle drive to manage, sell off some of the stock before winter comes. I'll be gone about a week, but when I get back, I'd like to see you again. If you'll allow it." "Why me?" Georgia asked. "You could have any woman in this town, women who aren't broken and scared and carrying knives." "Because you're strong," Adam said immediately. "Because you've survived things that would have crushed other people. Because you pulled a blade on me and didn't apologize for it, and I respect the hell out of that. And because when you touched my hand last night, even for just a moment, it felt like maybe I wasn't completely dead inside after all." His honesty took her breath away. Georgia had never had a man speak to her like this, with such raw vulnerability and hope. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. "All right," she heard herself say. "When you get back from Saguache, we can see each other again. But I need you to understand something, Adam. I don't know if I can be what you want. I don't know if I can let someone in like that. All I can promise is that I'll try." "That's all I'm asking," Adam said, and his smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Just a chance, just the possibility." They finished their meal talking about lighter things, about the town and the weather and the latest gossip making the rounds. Adam told her funny stories about his cattle, about the ornery bull who thought he ran the whole herd and the calf who'd gotten stuck in a mud puddle and had to be hauled out with ropes. Georgia found herself laughing, genuine laughter that felt strange and wonderful after so many years of guarded suspicion. When they finally left the restaurant, the sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. Adam walked her back to the seamstress shop again, and this time when they reached the door, Georgia didn't pull away quite so quickly. "Be safe on your cattle drive," she said. "Come back in one piece." "I'll do my best," Adam promised. "Will you think about me while I'm gone?" "Probably," Georgia admitted, "though I'll try not to make a habit of it." Adam laughed, a warm, rich sound that made her smile. "Fair enough. I'll be thinking about you, though. Wondering if you're all right, hoping you're eating properly, imagining what it'll be like to see you again." "Don't build it up too much in your head," Georgia warned. "I'm not some perfect angel waiting to save you from yourself." "Good," Adam said. "I don't want an angel. I want a real woman who knows how hard life can be and chooses to keep fighting anyway. I want someone who'll challenge me, keep me honest, remind me why living matters." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat to her and turned to walk away. Georgia watched him go, his tall figure disappearing into the gathering dusk, and felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the possibility of love, the first tender shoot of something that might grow into something beautiful if she could just find the courage to let it. The next week passed in a strange blur of anticipation and anxiety. Georgia threw herself into her work at the general store, helping Mrs. Patterson with inventory and serving customers with a smile that felt less forced than usual. At night, she lay in her small room and thought about Adam out on the trail, moving cattle across the high Colorado plains toward Saguache. She wondered if he was safe, if he was thinking about her the way she was thinking about him. It felt dangerous, this growing attachment to a man she barely knew. But it also felt inevitable, like water flowing downhill or leaves turning in the fall. Some things just were, regardless of whether they made sense or fit into her carefully constructed defenses. Mrs. Patterson noticed the change in her, of course. The older woman had sharp eyes and a kind heart, and she'd clearly decided that Adam and Georgia belonged together. "He's a good man," she said one afternoon, unprompted. "Lost so much, but he hasn't let it make him bitter. That takes strength of character." "I know," Georgia said quietly. "And you're a good woman," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Stronger than you realize. You've been hurt, I can see that clear as day. But you haven't let it break you. That counts for something." Georgia wanted to argue, to insist that she was broken in all the ways that mattered. But she was learning that maybe strength wasn't about being undamaged. Maybe it was about carrying your scars and moving forward anyway, about opening yourself to the possibility of pain, because the alternative was to never feel anything at all. On the 8th day after their supper together, Georgia was arranging a display of canned goods when the shop door opened and Adam walked in. He was dusty from the trail, his clothes worn and his face shadowed with stubble, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "You're back," Georgia said, and she couldn't quite keep the relief out of her voice. "I'm back," Adam confirmed. "Cattle drive went well, got a good price for the stock, but I'll admit I pushed the boys pretty hard to get home faster. Couldn't stop thinking about a certain woman with a knife and a guarded heart." Georgia felt heat rise to her cheeks, aware that Mrs. Patterson was watching this exchange with poorly concealed delight. "I should finish my work," she said. "Of course," Adam said. "But when you're done, if you're free, I thought maybe we could take a walk. There's something I'd like to show you if you're willing." "What kind of something?" Georgia asked suspiciously. "The kind that's best seen rather than described," Adam said with a mysterious smile. "But I promise you'll be safe. And if you want to bring your knife, that's fine too. I understand you need to protect yourself." Georgia looked at Mrs. Patterson, who made a shooing motion with her hands. "Go on, dear. It's almost closing time anyway. I can finish up here. Are you sure?" Georgia asked. "Positive," the widow said firmly. "Now go on before I lose patience with both of you." Georgia untied her apron and grabbed her shawl from the hook by the door. Adam offered his arm, and this time, after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His muscles were solid beneath her fingers, warm even through the fabric of his shirt, and she felt a strange thrill at the contact. They walked through town in the fading afternoon light, past the saloon and the hotel, and the little church where a few early arrivals were gathering for evening prayer. But instead of stopping at any of the familiar buildings, Adam led her out past the edge of town, following a narrow trail that wound up into the foothills. "Where are we going?" Georgia asked, slightly out of breath from the climb. "You'll see," Adam said. "It's not much farther." They crested a small rise, and suddenly the world opened up before them. Below lay Alamosa, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets that looked almost quaint from this distance. But beyond the town, the valley stretched out in shades of gold and green, bounded by mountains that rose like cathedral walls on either side. The peaks were still snow-capped, despite the late summer warmth, and the last rays of sunlight made them glow as if lit from within. "This is my favorite spot," Adam said quietly. "Found it my first week in Alamosa back before I bought the ranch. Whenever I'm feeling lost or overwhelmed, I come up here and just sit. Reminds me how small my problems are compared to the bigness of the world." Georgia stared at the view, struck speechless by its beauty. She'd seen mountains before, had crossed the Rockies on her way west, but she'd never taken the time to just stand and appreciate them, to let their majesty sink into her bones. "It's incredible," she breathed. "I wanted to share it with you," Adam said, "because I've been coming up here alone for 3 years, and I realized I don't want to be alone anymore. Not up here, not anywhere. I want to share the beautiful things with someone who can appreciate them." Georgia turned to look at him, and the expression on his face made her heart skip. He was looking at her the way she'd been looking at the mountains, with wonder and appreciation, and something that might have been the beginning of love. "Adam," she started, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. "I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know we barely know each other and you're not ready for promises or commitments, but I needed you to know that I'm serious about this, about you. I'm not playing games or looking for a temporary distraction. I'm looking for someone to build a life with, and I think maybe that someone could be you." Georgia's throat felt tight with emotion she couldn't name. Part of her wanted to run, to put distance between herself and this man who was offering her everything she'd ever wanted and been too afraid to reach for. But another part, a part that was growing stronger every day, wanted to stay. Wanted to see what might happen if she was brave enough to take a chance. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've never done this before, never let anyone close enough to really matter." "I'm scared too," Adam said. "Terrified, actually. Because caring about someone means you can lose them, and I've already lost so much. But I'm starting to think that the fear of loss is worse than the loss itself. At least if you love someone and lose them, you have the memories. If you never love at all, you have nothing but regrets." He had a point, Georgia thought. She'd spent so many years running and hiding, protecting herself from potential pain. But what had it gotten her? Loneliness, isolation, a half-life where nothing really touched her because she wouldn't let it. Maybe it was time to try something different. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly. "About Mary." Adam looked surprised, but he nodded. "She was a good woman, kind, patient, loved to laugh. We met when we were both working on a ranch in Wyoming. She was the owner's daughter and I was just a hired hand. Took me 2 years to work up the courage to court her, and another year to convince her father I was worthy of her. We got married when I was 24 and she was 22. Had 3 good years together before the fever took her and our baby girl." "What was your daughter's name?" Georgia asked gently. "Rose," Adam said, and his voice cracked slightly. "We named her Rose because Mary loved flowers, used to plant them everywhere she could. She was only 6 months old when the fever came. Barely had a chance to live before it was over." Georgia reached out without thinking and took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated contact deliberately, and she felt him go still with surprise. But he didn't pull away, didn't try to take more than she was offering. He just held her hand gently, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I'm sorry," she said. "That must have been unbearable." "It was," Adam admitted. "For a long time I didn't want to live, couldn't see the point in going on without them. But eventually I realized that Mary wouldn't want me to give up, to waste the life she'd fought so hard to keep. So I bought the ranch, started over in a new place, tried to build something that would honor her memory." "You still love her?" Georgia asked. "I'll always love her," Adam said honestly. "She was my first love, the mother of my child, but I've learned that the heart is bigger than we think. It can hold old loves and new ones, grief and hope, pain and joy all at the same time. Loving you doesn't mean I love Mary less. It just means I'm choosing to live again instead of just existing." The honesty of his words brought tears to Georgia's eyes. She'd spent so long thinking that vulnerability was weakness, that showing emotion made you a target. But here was this strong, capable man, laying his heart bare without shame or pretense. It made her want to be brave too, to risk the pain for the possibility of connection. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed, "how to let someone in. Every instinct I have tells me to run to protect myself." "Then we'll go slow," Adam said. "As slow as you need. I meant what I said that first night, Georgia. I'll wait until you reach for me, however long it takes." They sat on the hillside as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Adam told her more about his ranch, about the life he was building there. Georgia talked about her mother, dead these past 10 years, and the Cherokee stories she'd told. They talked about dreams and fears, about the things they'd lost and the things they hoped to find. By the time they walked back to town, full darkness had fallen and the first stars were appearing overhead. Georgia felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her burdens had made them easier to carry. And when Adam left her at her door with a gentle good night and a promise to see her tomorrow, she found herself looking forward to it instead of dreading it. The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt almost like courtship in the old-fashioned sense. Adam would come to town 2 or 3 times a week, always finding time to see Georgia. Sometimes they'd have supper together. Sometimes they'd just walk and talk. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never made her feel obligated or pressured. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Georgia felt her walls beginning to crumble. She found herself smiling more, laughing at Adam's dry humor and gentle teasing. She told him things she'd never shared with anyone, about her childhood and her fears, and her dreams of maybe someday having a place to call home. And Adam listened, really listened, with the same patience he'd shown that first night. He shared his own stories too, about growing up poor in Texas, about learning to work cattle from his grandfather, about the hard lessons life had taught him. They were both scarred people, Georgia realized, but maybe that was all right. Maybe their scars could complement each other, fitting together like puzzle pieces to create something stronger than either of them alone. One afternoon in early October, as the aspens were turning gold on the mountainsides, Adam showed up at the general store with a bouquet of wildflowers. They were simple blooms, probably picked from the meadow near his ranch, but Georgia had never received flowers before. She found herself blinking back tears as she accepted them. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "They reminded me of you," Adam said. Wild and resilient, thriving even in harsh conditions. Beautiful without trying to be. Mrs. Patterson, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, made a sound that might have been a sniffle. Georgia arranged the flowers in a jar and set them on the counter where she could see them while she worked. That evening, when Adam walked her home, Georgia did something that surprised them both. Instead of saying good night at the door, she stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek, quick and light as a butterfly landing. Adam went very still, his hand coming up to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. "Georgia," he breathed. "I'm trying," she said, "to be brave, to let you in. It's hard and I'm probably going to mess it up, but I'm trying." "You're doing beautifully," Adam said, and there was such warmth in his voice that Georgia felt her heart squeeze. "And I'm here for however long it takes. No rush, no pressure, just us, figuring this out together." By the time the first snow fell in late October, Georgia had grown accustomed to Adam's presence in her life. She looked forward to seeing him, missed him when he was busy with ranch work. She'd even agreed to let him teach her to ride, spending Sunday afternoons on a gentle mare named Daisy, learning the basics of horsemanship while Adam offered patient instruction. But despite the growing intimacy between them, Georgia still kept a part of herself locked away. She'd shared her past, her fears, her hopes, but she hadn't yet let Adam truly touch her, hadn't let herself imagine what it would be like to be fully vulnerable with another person, until the night everything changed. It was early November, and a storm was rolling in from the mountains. Georgia had stayed late at the general store, helping Mrs. Patterson prepare for the bad weather. By the time she finished, the wind was howling and snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond a few feet. She bundled up in her heaviest shawl and started the short walk to her room, but the storm was worse than she'd anticipated. The wind drove the snow into her face, making it impossible to see. She stumbled, disoriented, and realized with a spike of fear that she'd somehow gotten turned around in the whiteout. Then, through the howling wind, she heard someone calling her name. A moment later, Adam appeared out of the storm like an answer to a prayer. He was covered in snow, his face red from the cold, but his eyes were fierce with determination. "Thank God," he said, pulling her close without asking permission. "I was afraid you'd try to walk home in this. Come on, the hotel is closer than your room. We can wait out the storm there." Georgia didn't argue. The cold was seeping into her bones, and she could barely feel her feet. She let Adam guide her through the blinding snow, his arm around her waist keeping her upright. By the time they stumbled into the hotel lobby, they were both half frozen and covered in white. The hotel keeper, a portly man named Samuel, took one look at them and shook his head. "Terrible night to be out. You're lucky to have made it here. I've got one room left up on the second floor." Georgia started to protest, to say she couldn't possibly share a room with Adam, but her teeth were chattering too hard to get the words out. Adam seemed to understand her concern. "I'll sleep in the lobby," he said. "The lady can have the room." "Don't be ridiculous," Samuel said. "It's freezing down here. You'll catch your death. The room has 2 beds, perfectly respectable, and in weather like this, survival matters more than propriety." He had a point, Georgia thought, and despite everything, she trusted Adam not to take advantage of the situation. If he'd wanted to hurt her or force her, he'd had plenty of opportunities over the past months. Instead, he'd been nothing but patient and respectful, keeping his promises even when it must have been difficult. "All right," she said through chattering teeth, "but you stay on your side of the room." "Of course," Adam agreed immediately. They climbed the stairs to the small room, which was simple but clean, with 2 narrow beds separated by a nightstand and a small stove in the corner. Adam immediately set about building a fire, coaxing warmth from the cold metal while Georgia stood shivering by the door. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Adam said without looking at her. "There should be extra blankets in the chest. Wrap yourself up before you freeze." Georgia's fingers were so numb she could barely work the buttons on her dress. She struggled with them for a moment, frustration mounting, before Adam gently pushed her hands aside. "Let me help," he said quietly. "I'll close my eyes. Just talk me through the buttons." It was absurd and intimate all at once, standing there while Adam worked the fastenings of her dress by feel alone, his eyes squeezed shut, and his hands remarkably steady despite the cold. When he'd gotten the worst of it undone, he turned his back and faced the wall, giving her privacy to change. Georgia peeled off her wet dress and undergarments as quickly as her frozen fingers would allow, wrapping herself in the thick wool blankets from the chest. "All right," she said. "I'm decent." Adam turned back around, his own clothes still dripping. "Your turn," Georgia said. "I'll face the wall." She heard him moving behind her, the rustle of wet fabric and the creak of the floorboards. Then silence. When she turned back around, Adam was wrapped in blankets too, his wet clothes hanging over chairs near the stove to dry. They sat on their respective beds, the fire crackling between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind howled and snow battered the windows, but inside it was warm and safe and strangely peaceful. "Thank you," Georgia said finally, "for coming to find me. I was getting scared out there." "I couldn't leave you alone in that storm," Adam said simply. "When I saw how bad it was getting, I had to make sure you were safe. Mrs. Patterson told me you'd left the store, and I just knew you'd try to make it back to your room instead of seeking shelter." "You know me too well," Georgia said with a small smile. "Maybe," Adam agreed. "Or maybe I'm just learning to read you, learning what makes you tick, what scares you, what brings you joy." Georgia pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with her state of undress. "Can I ask you something? Anything," Adam said. "You ever regret this, trying to court someone like me, someone so damaged and difficult?" Adam's expression went soft. "Georgia, you're not damaged. You're a survivor. There's a difference. And I don't regret a single moment I've spent with you. You've brought light back into my life, reminded me what it feels like to hope for something beyond just getting through another day." "But I'm so guarded," Georgia protested. "So afraid all the time. You deserve someone who can give you everything, not someone who flinches when you get too close." "You're getting less guarded every day," Adam pointed out. "And I don't flinch when you talk about Mary and Rose." "We both carry pain, Georgia. That doesn't make us broken. It makes us human." "I want to be brave," Georgia whispered. "I want to be the kind of woman who can trust you completely, who isn't always waiting for the other shoe to drop, but I don't know how." Adam stood and crossed the small space between their beds. He sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them, careful not to crowd her. "Can I hold your hand?" he asked. Georgia nodded, and Adam's warm fingers closed around hers. They sat like that for a long moment, just holding hands in the firelight, and Georgia felt something shift inside her chest. This was what she'd been afraid of, she realized. Not the possibility of pain, but the possibility of joy. Because joy could be taken away, but pain was something you could learn to carry. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "And it terrifies me." Adam's grip on her hand tightened. "I'm already in love with you," he said quietly. "Have been for weeks now, but I was waiting for you to be ready to hear it." Georgia turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing the honesty and hope and patient love in his amber eyes. This man had waited months for her to feel safe, had respected her boundaries even when it must have been hard, had shown her through actions and words that she was worth the wait. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "I know," Adam said, "but maybe we can be scared together. Maybe that makes it easier." Georgia took a deep breath, then reached up and touched his face with her free hand. Adam went very still, barely breathing as her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone, learning the geography of him through touch. "Kiss me," she whispered. "Are you sure?" Adam asked, even though she could see the want in his eyes. "No," Georgia admitted, "but I'm trying to be brave, and I trust you, so kiss me, Adam, please." He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, to pull back, but Georgia didn't retreat. When his lips finally met hers, gentle and questioning, she felt something inside her chest crack open, years of defensive walls crumbling in the face of such tender care. The kiss was soft and sweet, nothing demanding or possessive about it. Just two people finding each other, learning what it felt like to be vulnerable and cared for at the same time. When they finally pulled apart, Georgia was crying, tears streaming down her face. "Did I hurt you?" Adam asked immediately, concern flooding his features. "No," Georgia said, laughing and crying at the same time. "No, you didn't hurt me. I'm just not used to feeling this much. It's overwhelming." Adam pulled her close, and this time Georgia didn't stiffen or pull away. She let herself be held, let herself rest against his chest, and listen to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside she felt safer than she had in years. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Adam told her more about the ranch, about his dreams of expanding the herd and maybe building a bigger house someday. Georgia shared her own dreams, tentative and half-formed, about having a real home and maybe a family of her own. "Come to the ranch," Adam said eventually. "Not to live, not yet, just to visit, to see the place. I want to show you the life I'm trying to build, see if maybe you could picture yourself being part of it." Georgia's heart skipped with equal parts excitement and terror. Visiting his ranch felt like a big step, an acknowledgement that this was becoming something real and serious. But she'd already decided to be brave, hadn't she? "All right," she said. "When?" "Next Sunday," Adam suggested. "I'll come get you in the morning, bring you out for the day, show you around, introduce you to the horses and cattle, make you lunch if you promise not to laugh at my cooking." "I can't promise that," Georgia said with a smile, "but I'll try to be polite about it." They talked until the fire burned low and exhaustion finally caught up with them. Adam insisted Georgia take the better of the two beds, and he settled onto the other one, keeping a respectful distance even though they were both still wrapped in blankets. "Good night, Georgia," he said softly. "Thank you for trusting me." "Good night, Adam," she replied. "Thank you for being worth trusting." She fell asleep listening to his steady breathing, feeling safer than she had in longer than she could remember. And when she woke in the morning to find him already up and dressed, his wet clothes somehow dry and the fire rebuilt, she realized that this was what love felt like. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but quiet constancy. Someone who made sure you were warm and safe, who respected your boundaries and celebrated your bravery. The storm had passed, leaving Alamosa buried under a foot of fresh snow. Adam walked Georgia back to the seamstress shop, and when they said goodbye, she stood on tiptoe and kissed him again, more confidently this time. "Sunday," she reminded him. "Sunday," he agreed, his smile bright as the sun on snow. When Sunday came, Georgia woke early, nervous energy making it impossible to sleep. She dressed in her best clothes, though they were worn and patched, and braided her hair with extra care. She hadn't been this anxious about anything in years. Adam arrived right on time, driving a wagon pulled by two sturdy horses. He helped her up onto the seat beside him, and they set off toward the mountains, following a rough trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The ranch was everything Adam had described and more. The cabin was small but solid, built from logs that had weathered to a soft gray. Smoke curled from the chimney, and through the windows Georgia could see neat curtains that must have been Mary's work. The stream Adam had mentioned ran crystal clear through the property, and beyond it stretched meadows where cattle grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," Georgia breathed, taking it all in. "Wait till spring," Adam said. "When the wildflowers bloom, it's like someone painted the whole valley in every color you can imagine." He showed her around with obvious pride, introducing her to his horses and pointing out improvements he'd made. The barn was well maintained, the fences sturdy, everything speaking of hard work and careful attention. This was a man who took pride in his labor, who built things to last. They had lunch in the cabin, simple fare of bread and cheese and cold meat, but Georgia enjoyed it more than any fancy meal. The cabin was cozy and warm, filled with touches that showed a woman had once lived here. The curtains, a quilt on the bed, dried herbs hanging from the rafters. You think about her when you're here, Georgia asked, gesturing at the feminine touches. Sometimes, Adam admitted. But it doesn't hurt the way it used to. I think Mary would be happy knowing I was moving on, that I'd found someone who could appreciate the life we started building here. I'm not trying to replace her, Georgia said quickly. I know, Adam said, and I wouldn't want you to. You're your own person, Georgia. I love you for who you are, not because you remind me of someone else. They spent the afternoon walking the property, Adam pointing out landmarks and sharing his plans for the future. Georgia found herself imagining what it would be like to live here, to wake up every morning to the sound of the stream and the sight of the mountains, to have a place that was truly hers, where she didn't have to keep looking over her shoulder or planning her next escape. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Adam drove her back to town. They rode in comfortable silence for a while before Georgia finally spoke. I could be happy here, she said quietly. That scares me, but it's true. I could see myself building a life in this place. Adam's hand found hers, warm and steady. Then maybe you should consider it. Not right away, I know you need time. But maybe someday when you're ready you could think about making this your home too. Georgia squeezed his hand, her heart full of emotions she was still learning to name. Ask me again in a few months, she said. When I've had time to get used to the idea. When I'm sure I won't wake up one morning and run away because I'm too scared to stay. I'll ask you every day if that's what it takes, Adam said with a smile. However long you need, Georgia, I'm not going anywhere. The winter months passed in a blur of quiet courtship and growing intimacy. Georgia and Adam saw each other as often as his ranch work and her job would allow, stealing moments together whenever they could. She grew more comfortable with his touch, with the casual affection of holding hands or resting her head on his shoulder. She even kept a few belongings at his cabin, small things like a spare dress and a hairbrush, though she still returned to her room above the seamstress shop every night. Mrs. Patterson watched this slow progression with maternal approval, occasionally reminding Georgia that she wasn't getting any younger and neither was Adam. And wouldn't it be nice to see them settled before another winter came? Georgia just laughed and promised to think about it, though in truth she was thinking about little else. By the time spring arrived, bringing the wildflowers Adam had promised, Georgia had made her decision. She was still scared, probably always would be to some degree. But she'd learned that fear didn't have to be a prison. It could be a challenge to overcome, a mountain to climb, a barrier to break through. One Sunday in late April, when the whole valley seemed drunk on sunshine and new growth, Georgia asked Adam to take her up to his favorite spot overlooking Alamosa. They climbed the familiar trail hand in hand, and when they reached the top, Georgia turned to face him. Ask me, she said simply. Adam's eyes widened with understanding and hope. Georgia Dawson, will you marry me? Will you come live at the ranch and help me build a life there? Will you take a chance on a broken cowboy who promises to love you and respect you and wait as long as you need, for as long as we both live? Yes, Georgia said, and the word felt like freedom. Yes to all of it. I'm still scared and I'll probably mess things up sometimes because I don't really know how to be in a relationship. But I love you, Adam Everett, and I want to try. Adam let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around while she laughed and held on tight. When he finally set her down, he kissed her properly, deeply, with all the passion he'd been holding back for months. And Georgia kissed him back, pouring into it all her fear and hope and fragile new courage. They were married 3 weeks later in the little church in Alamosa, with Mrs. Patterson and a few other townsfolk as witnesses. Georgia wore a simple white dress that the seamstress had helped her make, and Adam wore his Sunday best with a wildflower boutonniere. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Georgia felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "I love you," she whispered as they walked back down the aisle together. "I love you too," Adam replied. "Thank you for reaching for me." The early days of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Georgia had to learn to share space with another person, to let someone see her at her most vulnerable. There were moments when she panicked, when old fears rose up and made her want to run. But Adam was always patient, always willing to give her space when she needed it and comfort when she asked for it. He taught her to work cattle, to ride like she'd been born in the saddle, to shoot straight and rope true. She taught him to let his guard down, to talk about his feelings instead of bottling them up, to laugh more and worry less. Together they found a rhythm that worked for both of them, a partnership built on mutual respect and growing trust. Their first winter together was hard, the kind of brutal cold that tested even the strongest relationships. But they made it through, huddled together by the fire on the worst nights, talking and planning and dreaming about the future. And when spring came again, Georgia realized with a start that she'd made it a full year without running, without even thinking about running. "I'm happy," she told Adam one morning as they worked together to mend a fence. "Is that strange? I don't think I've ever been genuinely happy before." "Not strange at all," Adam said, pausing to kiss her forehead. "You deserve happiness, Georgia. You fought hard enough for it." In the summer of 1880, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror, memories of what had happened to Adam's first wife and child making her anxious and afraid. But Adam held her close and promised that this time would be different, that they'd get the best doctor money could buy and take every precaution. "We're going to be all right," he said firmly. "All three of us." Georgia wanted to believe him, but pregnancy made her vulnerable in ways she'd never been before. She couldn't ride as easily, couldn't work as hard, had to depend on Adam more than she was comfortable with. It chafed at her independent nature, but Adam never made her feel weak or useless. He just adjusted their routines, took on more of the heavy work, and made sure she had everything she needed. The baby came in late February of 1881, on a night when the snow was falling soft and steady outside the cabin windows. The doctor Adam had brought from Saguache coached Georgia through the long hours of labor while Adam paced outside, terrified and helpless. When the baby's first cry finally rang out, strong and healthy, Adam burst into the room to find Georgia exhausted but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "It's a boy," she said softly. "A beautiful, perfect boy." Adam approached slowly, almost reverently, and when Georgia placed their son in his arms, tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. "He's perfect," he breathed. "What should we name him?" "I thought maybe James," Georgia said, "after your grandfather, the one who taught you about cattle." "James Everett," Adam said, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world, little one." Watching her husband hold their newborn son, Georgia felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. This was what she'd been afraid of all those years, this depth of feeling, this vulnerability. But it was also more beautiful than anything she'd ever experienced. The early months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. James was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still needed constant care and attention. Georgia threw herself into motherhood with the same fierce determination she'd once applied to survival, learning as she went and refusing to be defeated by the challenges. Adam was a devoted father, taking James on walks around the ranch and talking to him about the cattle and horses as if the baby could understand every word. He sang lullabies in a slightly off-key voice, and changed diapers without complaint, and marveled at every tiny milestone. "We made this," he said one night, watching James sleep in the cradle he'd built with his own hands. "You and me together, we made a whole new person." "We did," Georgia agreed, leaning against his shoulder, "and somehow we haven't messed him up yet." "Give us time," Adam joked, and they both laughed quietly, careful not to wake the baby. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Adam expanded the herd and built new fences, hired a couple of hands to help with the heavy work. Georgia learned to manage the household accounts and started a small garden, growing vegetables that they sold in town for extra income. They weren't rich by any means, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. When James was 3, Georgia found herself pregnant again. This time she was less afraid, more confident in her body's ability to bring a child safely into the world. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1885, a tiny thing with Georgia's blonde hair and Adam's amber eyes. "What about Rose?" Adam asked quietly, looking at the sleeping newborn. "After my first daughter, if you're all right with that." Georgia felt tears prick her eyes, touched that he'd want to honor the baby he'd lost. "Rose is perfect," she said. "Rose Mary Everett." Their family felt complete now. A boy and a girl running around the ranch, filling the cabin with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of childhood. James was protective of his little sister, always watching out for her and making sure she didn't get into too much trouble. Rose was fearless and curious, constantly exploring and asking questions that Adam answered with infinite patience. The years passed in a blur of seasons and celebrations, of hard work and harder winters, of joy and occasional sorrow. They lost cattle to harsh weather and predators, struggled through lean years and celebrated good ones. But through it all, Georgia and Adam stood together, partners in every sense of the word. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Adam took Georgia back up to their special spot overlooking Alamosa. The town had grown in the past decade, new buildings sprouting up and more families settling in the valley. But the view was still breathtaking. The mountains still stood eternal and proud. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Adam asked, his arm around her waist. "I remember," Georgia said. "I was so scared of what you were offering, so sure it would all fall apart." "And now?" Adam prompted. "Now I know better," Georgia said with a smile. "Now I know that good things can last, that love doesn't always end in pain. You taught me that, Adam. You and the children and this life we've built together." "You taught me some things too," Adam said. "You reminded me that it's possible to heal, to move forward without forgetting the past. You showed me that strength comes in many forms, including the courage to be vulnerable." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the valley they'd made their home. Georgia thought about the frightened woman she'd been when she first pulled a knife on this patient cowboy, about all the miles she'd traveled both literally and emotionally to get to this moment. "I'm glad I reached for you," she said quietly. "That night in the hotel when I asked you to kiss me, I'm glad I was brave enough to try." "So am I," Adam said, pulling her closer. "Every day I thank God that you walked into that saloon and pulled a blade on me." "Best thing that ever happened to me," Georgia laughed, remembering that night and how different she'd been then. "Only you would call having a knife pulled on you the best thing that ever happened." "Well, it led to you, didn't it?" Adam pointed out. "And you led to James and Rose and this whole beautiful life. So yeah, I stand by my statement." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, knowing each other's bodies and hearts as well as they knew their own. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Georgia felt a contentment that still sometimes surprised her with its depth. The children grew. James became a skilled horseman and cattleman, learning everything his father could teach him about running a ranch. Rose showed an artistic talent, drawing pictures of the mountains and animals that decorated the cabin walls. Georgia watched them with a mother's pride and occasional terror, knowing that someday they'd grow up and leave to build their own lives. But that was still years away. For now, they were all together, a family unit that felt as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. In the summer of 1890, when James was 9 and Rose was 5, Georgia's past came calling. A man showed up at the ranch asking for her by her maiden name, claiming to be a Pinkerton detective working for the family of the man she'd cut all those years ago in Kansas City. Georgia's blood ran cold when Adam told her about the visitor. She'd almost forgotten about that night, about the spoiled rich boy who tried to force himself on her. Almost convinced herself it was ancient history that couldn't touch her anymore. "What does he want?" she asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "He wants to talk to you," Adam said carefully. "But he won't say about what. Should I send him away?" Georgia wanted to say yes, to run like she'd done so many times before. But she had a family now, a home worth fighting for. And she'd learned over the years that running only delayed the inevitable. "No," she said, straightening her spine. "I'll talk to him, but I want you with me." The detective was a thin man with sharp eyes and a notebook that he consulted frequently. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison and accepted Georgia's offer of coffee with cool politeness. "Mrs. Everett," he said, once they were all seated around the kitchen table. "I've been hired by the Preston family of Kansas City to locate a Georgia Dawson, who they believe may have information about an incident that occurred in 1878. "I remember the incident," Georgia said quietly. "Their son attacked me and I defended myself. Is that what they want to know?" Mr. Harrison looked surprised by her directness. "They're aware of what happened. Young Mr. Preston made a full confession before he died last year." Georgia's heart stopped. "He's dead. Consumption," Mr. Harrison said. "Took him slow. But before he passed, he apparently experienced something of a religious awakening. Confessed to a number of sins, including the assault on you. His parents were horrified to learn what their son had done. They've been trying to find you to apologize and offer restitution." Georgia sat back in her chair, stunned. This was not what she'd expected at all. "Restitution? The family feels terrible about what happened and about the fact that you were forced to flee," Mr. Harrison explained. "They want to offer you financial compensation for your suffering. And they wanted me to convey their deepest apologies." Adam reached over and took Georgia's hand, squeezing it gently. She looked at him, saw the pride and support in his eyes, and felt her racing heart begin to slow. "I don't need their money," she said finally. "What happened to me was terrible, but it led me here. To this life, to my family. I wouldn't change that for anything." "They anticipated you might feel that way," Mr. Harrison said, producing an envelope from his coat. "So they've set up a trust fund in your name. You don't have to use it if you don't want to, but it'll be there if you ever need it. For your children's education, perhaps, or any emergency that might arise." Georgia accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a bank certificate for an amount that made her eyes widen in shock. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to send both children to the finest schools, to expand the ranch tenfold if they wanted. "This is too much," she whispered. "It's what they felt was appropriate," Mr. Harrison said. "Consider it a small compensation for the pain their son caused and the life you had to leave behind." After the detective left, Georgia and Adam sat in silence for a long time, just holding hands and processing what had happened. Finally, Adam spoke. "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know," Georgia admitted. "Part of me wants to refuse it, to say I don't need anything from them. but another part thinks about what we could do with that money, the opportunities it could give our children. It's your choice, Adam said firmly. Your past, your decision. I'll support you whatever you decide. In the end, they put most of the money into savings for the children, keeping enough aside to make some much-needed improvements to the ranch. They built a bigger house, one with separate bedrooms for the children and a real kitchen with a cast-iron stove. They hired more hands and bought better breeding stock for the cattle, but they were careful not to let the money change who they were or how they lived. "We're still the same people," Georgia told Adam one night as they sat on the porch of their new house, watching the sunset. "The money is nice, but it's not what makes us happy." "No," Adam agreed. "What makes us happy is right here. You, me, the children, this land. Everything else is just extra." The years continued to pass, bringing with them the inevitable changes of time and age. Georgia's hair began to show threads of silver, and Adam's face grew more lined and weathered. But they aged together, growing into their later years with grace and gratitude for the life they'd built. James grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, but with his mother's quick mind and fierce determination. When he turned 18, several families in the area made it known that they'd welcome him as a son-in-law. But James took his time, clearly having learned from his parents that love was worth waiting for. Rose proved to be as independent and spirited as Georgia had been at her age, with dreams of becoming a teacher and helping other children learn. She read voraciously, going through every book they could get their hands on, and her artistic skills continued to develop until she could capture the beauty of their valley with stunning accuracy. In the spring of 1895, when Georgia was approaching her 40th birthday, James came home with news that he'd asked a local girl named Sarah to marry him. She was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a kind and practical young woman who clearly adored him. "She reminds me a bit of you, Ma," James said with a smile. "Strong-willed and independent, not afraid to speak her mind. I figured if Dad could be happy with someone like that, so could I." Georgia laughed and pulled her son into a hug, proud of the man he'd become. "You chose well." "When's the wedding?" "Fall," James said. "After the harvest is in. We want to start our life together right, with hard work and good timing." The wedding was a beautiful affair, held on a crisp October day with the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides. Georgia watched her son marry his sweetheart and felt the bittersweet ache of seeing your child take their first real step into adulthood. Adam stood beside her, his hand finding hers automatically, and she knew he felt it too. "They'll be all right," he whispered. "We raised them right." "I know," Georgia said, "but it's hard to let go." "You never really let go," Adam said. "You just loosen your grip a little, give them room to make their own choices, their own mistakes, their own happy memories." James and Sarah built a small house on the eastern edge of the ranch property, close enough to help with the work but far enough to have their own space. And when they announced the following spring that they were expecting their first child, Georgia felt the joy of impending grandmotherhood mixed with memories of her own early days as a mother. Rose, meanwhile, pursued her dream of teaching. She attended a normal school in Denver, coming home for summers and holidays with stories of city life that both fascinated and horrified her parents. But she never forgot where she came from, and she always spoke of returning to Alamosa someday to teach the children of the valley. Georgia's first grandchild, a boy named Adam after his grandfather, arrived in early 1897. Holding the tiny infant, Georgia marveled at how life came full circle, how the scared woman who'd once pulled a knife on a stranger had somehow ended up here, surrounded by family and love, and the continuation of the legacy she and Adam had begun. "He's beautiful," she told Sarah, carefully returning the baby to his mother's arms. "You and James did good work." "We learned from the best," Sarah said warmly. "You and Adam showed us what a real partnership looks like." As Georgia and Adam entered their later years, they slowly turned more of the ranch operations over to James and Sarah. Adam's joints ached more in the cold weather now, and Georgia found that she tired more easily than she used to. But they were content to sit on the porch and watch the younger generation take over, offering advice when asked, but mostly just enjoying the fruits of their long labor. Rose eventually returned to Alamosa as she'd promised, taking a position at the growing town's new schoolhouse. She married a few years later, a bookish young man who worked at the newspaper and shared her love of learning. They gave Georgia and Adam 2 more grandchildren, girls who were as bright and curious as their mother. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Georgia and Adam made the climb up to their special spot one more time. It was harder now, their bodies not as young and spry as they once were, but they took their time and eventually reached the top. The view was still breathtaking, though Alamosa had grown into a proper town below them. Where once there had been a handful of rough buildings, now there were shops and schools and churches, a railroad depot bringing in newcomers and connecting them to the wider world. But the mountains remained unchanged, eternal and magnificent. 25 years, Adam said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together. Both are true, Georgia said, leaning against his shoulder. Time is strange that way. Do you remember what I said that first night? Adam asked. When you pulled your knife on me. You said you'd wait until I reached for you, Georgia replied. And you kept that promise. You waited until I was ready, until I could choose you freely. Best decision I ever made, Adam said. Patience was hard, but you were worth waiting for. Georgia turned to look at him, at the man who had changed everything for her. His hair was mostly gray now, his face deeply lined from years of sun and wind. But his eyes were still the same warm amber, still looked at her with the same love and patience they'd held that first night. I used to think my knife was the only thing I could trust, she said softly. The only thing that would protect me. But you taught me that some things are worth the risk of trusting, that not everyone is out to hurt you, that love, real love, is patient and kind and worth fighting for. You taught me things too, Adam said. You reminded me that life doesn't end with loss, that it's possible to love again without betraying the past. You gave me a second chance at family, at happiness, at hope. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in glorious shades of orange and pink and purple. Below them, in the valley they'd helped build, their family was gathering for the anniversary dinner George's children had planned. There would be food and laughter and grandchildren running underfoot, all the beautiful chaos of a life well lived. Ready to head back? Adam asked eventually. In a minute, Georgia said. I just want to remember this. This view, this moment, this feeling of being completely content with where I am and who I'm with. Me too, Adam agreed, pulling her closer. Me too. As they finally made their way back down the trail, hand in hand as they'd been for 25 years, Georgia thought about the journey that had brought her here. All the running and hiding, all the fear and pain, all the careful walls she'd built around her heart. And then one night in a saloon in Colorado, a patient cowboy had reached for her hand, and everything had changed. She'd pulled a blade when he touched her. He'd said he'd wait till she reached for his. And in that exchange, in that moment of respect and patience and unexpected understanding, the foundation for something beautiful had been laid. It hadn't been easy. Love never was, but it had been worth it. Every moment of fear overcome, every wall torn down, every risk taken had led to this. a life filled with family and purpose, and the deep satisfaction of knowing you'd built something that would outlast you. The dinner was everything Georgia could have hoped for. The house was full of people she loved, eating food they'd prepared together, sharing stories and laughter and love. James and Sarah's children played with Rose's daughters, the next generation already forming bonds that would last a lifetime. Adam sat at the head of the table, looking around at the family they'd created with an expression of such joy and pride that Georgia felt tears prick at her eyes. After dinner, as the children played outside and the adults lingered over coffee, James stood and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, "who showed us all what real love looks like, who taught us that strength and gentleness aren't opposites, that patience is its own kind of courage, who built this ranch and this family from nothing but hard work and hope. May we all be lucky enough to have what you have." Everyone raised their glasses and drank to the toast, and Georgia felt Adam's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently. This was what mattered, she thought. Not the money they'd saved or the land they owned, but the people they'd raised and the love they'd shared. As the years continued to pass, Georgia and Adam settled into a peaceful retirement. They'd lived long enough to see their grandchildren grow, to watch Alamosa transform from a rough frontier town into a thriving community. They'd seen the old century give way to the new, welcoming the 1900s with the wisdom of people who'd survived much and were grateful for every day they were given. They took walks together around the ranch, moving slower now, but still enjoying the land they'd worked so hard to build. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the mountains change colors with the setting sun, comfortable in the silence that came from knowing each other so well that words weren't always necessary. On a warm spring evening in 1906, as they sat together watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard, Adam turned to Georgia with a thoughtful expression. "Any regrets?" he asked. Georgia considered the question seriously. She thought about the hard years before she'd met Adam, about the pain and fear and loneliness. She thought about the risks she'd taken in choosing to trust him, the vulnerability of opening her heart. She thought about the challenges they'd faced together, the losses and struggles and hard winters. "Not a single one," she said finally. "Every hard thing led me here to you, to this life. I wouldn't change any of it." "Good," Adam said with satisfaction. "Me neither. Though I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if you'd actually stabbed me that first night instead of just threatening me with your knife." Georgia laughed, the sound rich and full and utterly content. "Well, we'll never know. You were too charming for your own good, waiting till I reached for you. Who could resist that kind of patience?" "Apparently not you," Adam said with a grin. "Lucky for me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the children play and the sun sink lower in the sky. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to the life they'd built and the love they'd shared. And as the first stars began to appear overhead, Georgia reached for Adam's hand once more, just as she had that night in the hotel when she'd first chosen to be brave. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady and sure, exactly as they'd always been. And in that simple gesture, in that everyday moment of connection, Georgia felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She'd come to Colorado running from her past, armed with nothing but a knife and her determination to survive. She'd met a cowboy who'd respected her enough to wait, to give her time and space and the power to choose. And she'd chosen love, chosen trust, chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of everything she'd lost. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick. But sitting here with Adam's hand in hers, surrounded by the family they'd created and the life they'd built, Georgia knew without a doubt that it had been worth it. Every moment of fear overcome, Every wall torn down, every risk taken, all of it had led to this perfect, ordinary, extraordinary moment. And that was more than she'd ever dared to dream, back when she was just a scared woman with a blade and a heart too wounded to hope. But hope had found her anyway. Love had found her. And in the patient, steady presence of a cowboy who knew how to wait, Georgia Dawson Everett had finally found home.